My name is Gretchen Andrew, and I'm hosting a series of conversations as part of my residency with Gazzelli Art House and Gazzelli IO that really just invites women who I really admire, specifically those who work in art and technology, artificial intelligence, to hear about the ways in which what they do is very informed by who they are. And the thesis behind this conversation comes from a feeling that I've started to really explore in my work, that when women are very unique to themselves, there's something almost inherently feminist in it because they're just not trying to fit into these pre-existing forms. My guest I'm very excited about today is Tracy Bartley. She's the director at the RB Kitaj Estate, and this is what I wrote this morning, and she did approve it. I said she specializes in maximizing the cultural value of an artist's legacy and works both with the state and living artists to organize and create their place in history. So thank you for joining me, Tracy.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. That's my understanding based on knowing you of what you do, but I'm really curious to hear about your story and how you got to working the way that you work, and how you like to tell that process.
Okay. Well, I have, out of high school, I decided I wanted to be a painter, went to art school, decided quite quickly that I wasn't a painter, but that I loved art and artists and process, and became obsessed with that. So after my BFA in painting, I decided to go into art conservation, and took some science that I needed to get that going, and then did a master's degree in painting conservation, which allowed me to look more at technique and how the artist works and all these things that had really kind of sparked my interest during art school. And from there, I applied for an internship at the Getty in their Getty Conservation Institute. And they were looking for an intern who would help organize a conference around contemporary art conservation issues. So specifically looking at how contemporary artists were exploring materials and ideas around legacy, and how should an artwork last? Does it need to last? Who makes those decisions? And how do we document the work to ensure that it has a place in history, whether or not the physical object stays? So I was there for a few years, and while I was there, I met Kitaj, who had just moved to Los Angeles. And invited him to come speak at the event at the Getty. And he and I got along very well. And he offered me the opportunity to come and manage the studio, which excited me in the idea that I'd have a real hands-on look at how an artist's process evolved in the studio. So I did that. Goodness, that was 1998, and he died in 2007. So I was there during his time in Los Angeles. And upon his death, the estate asked me to come in and manage the estate. So afterwards, so I've been there since 2007, and along the way have had the wonderful opportunity to work with various artists on the side, doing estate planning. I understood through the process we went through with Kitaj how important kind of the groundwork is to ensuring the legacy is framed in the way an artist wants it to be framed. So that's kind of the short version.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that really jumps out for me is, like, you're saying that you, when you were at art school, you're really interested in process. And
Yes.
I look at what you do, and I think about it being the process of making meaning, right?
Mm.
Like which is exactly, at least the way I think of my practice is that, if I just did this in a cave, or, without sharing and being in community, it might have personal meaning, but can you speak a little bit more about the process of how you go from an artist studio to, like I said, that making of that historical meaning, and some of the things that you really think are not just kind of important within your industry, but the things that you really passionately working with artists like to focus on?
Sure. I think for me, and this really is informed by my time with Kitaj, who did a lot of writing about his art, which he was heavily criticized for.
Oh, that's interesting, like because he was too involved in the critic's job, or
Exactly. Exactly. So if quite famously, there's an incident that's referred to in her history with Kitaj as the Tate War. So he had a major retrospective in the, I guess it was the early 90s. I'd have to look it up. My brain's a little foggy these days.
It's early.
It was at the Met, LACMA, and the Tate. So it originated through the Tate and then traveled to LACMA and the Met. And he wrote what he called prefaces to go with much of the work in the show and wanted it to be on wall labels included in the exhibition. And his work is very layered with storytelling and historical references, and he'll often make up quite elaborate stories to go with a picture. And he wanted to share those with the audience. The critics were not impressed. And it was slammed, especially in London. The reviews were horrible. And his wife, during this process, the show had closed at the Tate, was coming to LACMA, and his wife suffered a brain aneurysm and died. And Kitaj held the critics responsible for her death. And that kind of churned out even more writing. And he wrote 2 manifestos, and it became such a big part of his work. So that documentation and that storytelling has always really fascinated me. I like to know the artist's story. I know some schools of thought think that should be informed more by the viewer, but to me, that's a huge part of the work of art. And I enjoy that piece. So recording that, keeping that alive, looking at it as part of the work is something I like to do when I'm in a studio with an artist like Derek Boucher. I love hearing about what he was doing when he created this work of art. What else was going on in his life? What was informing his process? So it's more than just the technical piece, which also fascinates me from their art conservation standpoint, but it's that bigger story around a work that I really enjoy trying to capture. Whether or not, what happens with that in the future, but having that record, I think has great value within the art historical context of a work of art.
It's really interesting too, in terms of this this other theme that I'm interested in is really about control.
Yes.
And in my practice, it manifests itself in this, like, there's a supposed like ceding of control, but then I'm going onto the computer and I'm sort of doing the back end to make it look like, like I've been thinking about it more as sort of like I'm praying to this God, and then I'm going and I'm being God in the background at the same time in this Wizard of Oz way. And so one of the things I did want to do in these conversations is pull out some of these themes, but that I see in my work and I'm seeing in my guest work. And I want to hear more about how you feel about control, just as Kitaj seemed like he was very interested in holding as much control as possible.
Yes.
That was upsetting some people. And then you, especially now with the estate, you control, not in like a maniacal way, but there's a huge question of who makes the meaning and who has that power. I'd like to hear more about.
So that's, working with living artists at something that I like them to have that opportunity to control the narrative. This is their opportunity. And I share with them to kind of shape what you want your legacy to look like. It's, if no one else is going to record it. Can you let the dog out? Sorry, my dog's gonna cry in a minute. The artist has this opportunity to control the narrative as much. And as I said before, what happens with that in the future, people might ignore it. And that's, we can't control that end of it, how it's received, but we can have it available. And someday someone might grab that. With the estate, Kitaj was very much about control. If he was interviewed, the questions needed to be sent to him written out beforehand, and he would write answers to them. He didn't like to give oral. There's very few video recording interviews of him. James Scott has one that's famous from the 60s that's excellent, but it's very rare because he didn't like to cede that control. With the estate, we've made a decision that we will not exert that same kind of control. And this was made by his family, that will allow new interpretations of the work to come out, because we really do want to grow an audience as part of his legacy building and make sure that he's being accessed by new eyes, younger voices, all those things. So we don't pre-approve any text that's written on him. We don't edit anything that's written on him, unless if there's a glaring error, if someone's attributed a work of art to him that's not, we certainly will send a note on that. But overall, we try to allow interpretation by whoever artist, writer, critic to go ahead without
Yeah,
our
I guess. No, just to say, I guess it seems that like his ideas, his legacy, and the way that you operate within this is, you have a feeling that it's wider than what he thought is. It leads to those potential misunderstandings, but then really does. And you see the show at LA Louvre where he did the collages as an example of that. Would he have wanted to be perceived as a collage artist? Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. So he wasn't, during his life, didn't really promote his prints. So that show was a series of collage work that had then been turned into screen prints. And the collage work was kind of the collateral that was shared with his master printmaker to realize the screen prints. So they weren't necessarily standalone works of art, although he had donated a few of them to major institutions. The V&A has a couple. I think the Tate has one. After his death, we donated a couple to LACMA. And so, with Kitaj, there was always this kind of control, but release at the same time. And so I was really interested with my background on thinking more about his technique. There's a lot of exhibitions on Kitaj around his faith, on Judaism, on his love of books, so very specific themes, but I wanted something that was more technical and to look at really his process as well as his relationship with the printmaker. So that show wouldn't have been a show, I think, that would have been realized during his lifetime. That was something that was definitely looking at the material we had in the estate. What could we take and teach people about Kitaj in a new way that might not have been looked at before?
Something that this really reminds me of is I've been involved in the Wikipedia community for a number of years, looking specifically at, so Wikipedia is one of these things where in order to get information on Wikipedia, it has to be archived and sourced in a particular way, which becomes quite problematic for a lot of women artists or a lot of women in general whose estates were not looked after in the same sort of historical way that, a particular debate I got into on there is how the female body can't be represented by women or as many women because it needed to be a famous dead artist for them to allow it. And, getting into these discussions of what is saved and why it was saved and who it was sort of preserved by, how have you seen in your field a shift towards artists, whether at like an earlier stage in their career, being more cognizant of, I don't know, what kind of either triaging information because of control, but also just, we're good friends with Penny Slinger. Penny Slinger has her, essentially her archives in the bank vault in this in the basement of this building here. And her perspective is always, as is with my mentors, Billy, is save everything. Save everything you can afford to carry around with you. How have you seen that evolving? And
it's interesting, and I think it's twofold. I think it's generational in a lot of ways, and I also think thinking of Penny and thinking, I work a lot with Gwen Mural, who's a sculptor here in LA. Women are I see traditionally as very good record keepers. A lot of estates of male artists are often cared for by wives or sisters or daughters. There's this kind of caretaker role. They've saved everything. They've documented everything. The Hopper estate has these fabulous journals that his wife did sketches of every single painting he did and notated what he was doing with every painting. And they're included in his catalog raisonné as part of the work. So I see that piece. And then generationally, I think a younger generation artist is much better because of being digitally savvy, tech savvy. They understand kind of databases and how to store things in a way that a lot of older artists don't seem to be. I still work with artists who have their index cards or boxes and boxes and boxes of unlabeled slides. So we're very fortunate now to be able to have digital photography and easy ways to record process. So that's kind of twofold in that way. But I've always found the kind of the gender roles in this industry fascinating. I've gone to the Aspen Institute does an Artist Endowed Foundations Leadership course, which I participated in, which was mainly women. I also did a appraisal studies program, which was mainly women. I think this idea of caring for things is kind of inherently feminine, and I find that fascinating, that it's a group of women who are supporting these legacies, and somewhat problematic. I think you do often, not often, you do occasionally see sons coming in. Kitaj's executors are his son and his daughter-in-law, but his son has chosen not to be actively involved. It's just not, he has his own career and his thing, and he trusts that we're taking a good care of his father's legacy and leaves it at that. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and this is also just making me think a little bit about just the way, as you were describing that process, for some reason, the feeling of, you know, talking a bit about like your meeting making and the way that, you know, you're organizing these things into meaning and making that available for other people. Your background is, or it started in painting. Do you feel like there's a relationship to composition in, like, I absolutely get that when you work with an artist, you're interested in what their end composition is, but the way you speak about it feels very informed, that you know what the output, you know what the finished object of a career might look like. And yeah, how do you think that?
I like that. I haven't thought about that at all, but I like that idea. And I think that, you know, when I was in art school, I would find myself, I loved crit because I loved talking about other people's work and hearing what people were saying. My personal process of painting wasn't something that excited me very much. I was so much more interested in hearing the stories of how other people develop their work. But I must say, when I think, one of my problems I had with art making was this sense of control and having a lot of difficulty loosening up. So I like things organized. I like things presented in a certain way. And that may inform why I made the choices I made. Painting conservation is very meticulous, tiny little tools. You know, you're meant to be as least amount of invasive procedure. You want as much of the artist's hand restored so it doesn't, you know, you can't tell that you've been there. And I love that process. Given a different, you know, arc of career, that's probably, I would have stayed in that world. Mm-hmm. But the opportunity to work specifically with artists in an intimate way. After Kitaj, the first artist I really worked with was Charles Garabedian, who was a painter here in LA who had cancer and knew that he didn't have a lot of time left. And his wife was very concerned about what would happen to the studio when he died. And he hadn't really kept records of anything. So we would sit down. He didn't have a lot of energy. He was still painting. He had a big show at Louvre and a retrospective at Santa Barbara Museum of Art that he was working on. We'd sit every day and talk about the work and organizing that for him, mapping out the studio so that his wife and his children had a document of exactly what things were where and how that looked and what they had, was incredibly rewarding to me. And I liked the idea that it was like creating my own artwork. So,
well, something I also think a lot about is these systems that, like, in a lot of ways, your role is to not have, not a perspective, right? But there's a removal of part of, it's not your, it's
right,
you're in.
Right.
So I think about systems that are trying to be as unbiased as possible. I think about internet, I think about good journalism, but something that's really interesting to me is the ways in which it's always coming through a lens of who the person is, of values, as much effort as possible going into not being a personality, I guess, is like there's an inevitable. So when I think about artists that work with you and choose to work with you, maybe as a last question, could you just say a couple of what your, either your passions or your values are in this, that you compared to somebody else might bring to the way that information in the state is managed?
Sure. I think, because I spent so much time working so closely with Kitaj, that he really informs so much of what I do. He led a rather hermetic life here in LA. He didn't like to go out. So he and I, his most intimate relationship was with me. And so I think that idea of caretaker to me is something that I value a lot. That I can bring to an artist this opportunity for them to have their legacy framed in a way that they want it to be framed. They'll often say, "Oh, that doesn't matter." I'll go, "Well, maybe it does. Let's talk about this a little bit more. Let's write down." And if no one ever looks at it, that's okay, but it exists. And I really believe that someday some young scholar or some young artist will discover something that we've put together and be informed by it. It may be in a minor way, it may be in a major way, who knows? And I like that anonymity, that it's not specific to how I feel about the artist. It's more about how the artist is leaving as much information that they think is valuable as possible. So
through
that's the
value of that personal relationship as well. It sounds like by getting to know someone and being friends with them, for a lack of a better term, you can better manage their estate and their work, because you're observing their.
Absolutely. I think that a lot of it is, as an artist, I'm sure you feel connected to these artworks in a very strong way. They were like Kitaj's children in some ways. And when we put on an exhibition after his death, and I'm in a room full of the last paintings he was working on in his studio, it felt like this reunion of souls in a space. And being able to be part of that, it has been incredibly rewarding, for sure.